This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn, standing in for Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. A quick reminder about the future of Knowing Animals. Many of you will know that Siobhan O'Sullivan, the podcast's regular host, was diagnosed last year with ovarian cancer. Siobhan does plan to record some more episodes of Knowing Animals for release over the coming months. However, Siobhan and I have agreed that, for the foreseeable future, it's best if my involvement with the podcast remains. This means that regular listeners will be hearing a lot more from me as we go forward, and I'm sure we all wish Siobhan the best. Before I introduce today's guest, let me give a quick shout out to our sponsors. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by AASA, that's AASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. To learn more about AASA, you can follow them on Twitter or on Facebook, or you can check out their website. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press, and I'm very pleased to say that Siobhan plans to talk to some of the authors of recent books in that series for future episodes of Knowing Animals. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Nora Castle. Nora is a PhD student in the Department of English and Comparative Literary Studies at the University of Warwick in the UK. Her thesis is provisionally entitled Food, Foodways and Environmental Crisis in Contemporary Speculative Fiction. And, as the title would suggest, she's interested in food and in science fiction. Today, we're going to be talking about her chapter, You Eat or You Die, Sixth Extinction Cannibalism in Contemporary Speculative Fiction, which is imminently forthcoming in the Routledge collection Interdisciplinary Essays on Cannibalism, edited by Giulia Champion. Welcome to the podcast, Nora.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, a few episodes ago, I said that one of the great things about being an academic is that I get to ask some really weird questions with a completely straight face. And today I get to ask another one. Nora, what got you interested in cannibalism?
It's sort of started because of my research more generally in food studies, but also because the collection that this chapter is in is coming out of a conference that happened at the University of Warwick in 2018, which was put on by Giulia, who is the editor of the collection, called Bites Here and There, Literal and Metaphorical Cannibalism Across Disciplines. And I actually applied to this conference before I even started my PhD at Warwick, so it was, weirdly enough, kind of my entree into academia was listening to a bunch of people talk about eating each other. But I think with my interests in science fiction and environmental humanities and food studies coming together, I was looking for primary sources that talked about food and ecological stress. And in a lot of these novels, you tend to go for post-apocalyptic futures. And so that goes to food scarcity, which tends to inevitably lend itself to cannibalism narratives. So it's sort of, I fell into it a little bit by accident, kind of like how I fell into animal studies. I'm not quite the cannibalism lady. I think maybe more Giulia would be the cannibalism lady, although she does do other things. But yeah, I'm definitely in that scene now.
Could you tell us a little bit more about some of the other papers at this conference and some of the other papers in this book?
Sure. So the conference was pretty interdisciplinary. There were a lot of literary studies folks, but there were also folks from art history, from sociology, from anthropology, from history. And interestingly enough, the cannibalism conference was focused not just on literal cannibalism, but also metaphorical cannibalism. So there's a Brazilian thing called anthropophagia, probably saying that terribly, but sorry to all the Brazilians listening, that is almost cultural cannibalism. So taking the good things from other cultures or even colonizing cultures and keeping them and using them and revamping them. So there was a really broad range, and that's reflected in the edited collection.
So let me turn to your paper. You spend most of the paper offering a close analysis of two novels that well, I hope you don't mind me saying, I hadn't actually heard of before reading this paper. And that's Don LePan's 2009 novel Animals and Joseph DeLacy's 2008 novel Meat. So could you tell us a little bit about these two novels and especially the role that cannibalism plays in them?
Sure. So I'll start with Animals by Don LePan. That one, well, so both of the novels actually are set after these great extinctions. So the sixth extinction that I'm talking about in the title of my paper and throughout the paper is the loss of biodiversity that's actually happening in our world now. So since I think it's about 60% of biodiversity we've lost since 1970, that's the figure that's generally used. So these novels kind of take that to its logical conclusion. And in both of them, there's been great extinctions of most animals aside from humans. So in Animals, there's still some animals left and there's still other food sources. So I think there's goats, but for the most part, it's just humans left. And in Meat, something similar happens where there's a great extinction, but the only animals that are left are humans. So both of these novels then reform factory farming or reform meat foodways by redesignating certain groups of humans as subhuman or non-human. So in Animals, they do that through particularly ableist rhetoric, and it draws on these Nazi-based eugenicist narratives to separate humans into humans and what they call mongrels. And the mongrels are people who are neuroatypical or disabled, and then those become the food. So it's quite disturbing, honestly. The plots of both of these novels are quite disturbing, and it's difficult to read them. I've recommended the books to other people, not thinking about how disturbing they are and then realizing that later. So in Meat, something similar happens where there's a separation of certain humans from other humans, but it's not based on disability or whether or not they're neuroatypical, but it's based on some sort of religious logic. So it's not quite shown how they do the initial separation, but the separation at the point that we come to the novel is that certain people are quote unquote chosen, and those people are the ones who are to be eaten, and it's sort of taking the "this is my body given for you" ad absurdum. The basis for both novels is this idea that even in a post-animal world, people will still want to eat meat, and how do we fulfill that need?
Do you see these novels as kind of critiques of contemporary relationships between humans and animals, or would that be kind of too reductionist a reading of them?
I mean, I think it's definitely doing that. I think both of them are doing that. I believe in DeLacy's Meat, he has a foreword to the novel in the edition that I have, talking about how writing the novel made him change his own dietary practices. And I can't remember if he became vegetarian or vegan. So it's definitely doing that. It's taking this novum of cannibalistic industrialized foodways and using it to critique the animal agricultural system, although I don't think that's the only thing that it's doing. So in the chapter I talk about how really it's an indictment of late capitalism and the way that some humans, so mostly sort of Western, often white, often male humans, treat the planet and planetary resources as infinite even though they're finite. And so I think that there's a double layer of analysis there. But that core of critiquing the animal agriculture system is definitely in there.
One line in your paper that really stuck with me after I'd read it was the claim that Don LePan's Animals presents the idea that, quote, it is easier to imagine the acceptance of cannibalism than an end to meat eating. Do you think that's true?
The line itself is sort of a play on it has become easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, which is a Frederick Jameson quote. It's also attributed to Slavoj Žižek, so there's a bit of a fight about who actually said it. But it's sort of a play on that, which is this idea that some of these institutions and conventions are so entrenched that it feels impossible to see a way out of them. And it just as it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, it's easier to imagine the acceptance of cannibalism than an end to meat eating. I think that it's taking it to an extreme on purpose. That's sort of by taking it to an extreme, that's how the novels make their points. It could be true. I think it's getting into the ridiculous territory, but I think it's doing it in a productive way. So I would say I don't know that I believe that, but I could see a world in which it's true.
I'm intrigued by your use of the word ridiculous. What do you think is the value of engaging with these ridiculous narratives?
Yeah, so when we look at something that's ridiculous, like, for example, imagining that we're going to be factory farming humans, it seems so absurd, it's easy to just laugh at it and dismiss it. But at the same time, it makes it, I think, a bit easier to analyze because there's more cognitive distance there. And I think it's true. Like, if you, I'm not an expert in this, but if you look at sort of the history of clowns and jesters, their purpose, a jester's purpose, was to tell the truth to the king, but in a funny way, so that the things that needed to be said could be said, but in a lighthearted manner that didn't offend. And I think that's really productive and useful, and you can use that in terms of, in a way of sort of viewing the world through a different prism that brings different things to the fore.
Yes, I see what you mean. I was quite struck when I started thinking about this topic of cannibalism in speculative fiction that it's actually quite easy to think of a range of novels and works of fiction of various kind that engage with this particular theme. And so I was wondering if you think that your analysis of cannibalism in Animals and Meat, both as a critique of capitalism, but a critique as well of the way that we use animals in the contemporary world, could extend to other cases of cannibalism in contemporary speculative fiction. So, I mean, for example, I was thinking about Cormac McCarthy's The Road, which is a kind of apocalyptic vision where there is cannibalism, but in a slightly different way. And then that recent novel by Agostina Bazterrica, Tender is the Flesh. Do you think that your analysis could extend to these other works as well?
Yeah, definitely, especially Tender is the Flesh. So The Road is more sort of overtly survival cannibalism, so it's less institutionalized, which is sort of more what I'm focusing on in this chapter. There's definitely room to talk about survival cannibalism, and I think that there are other essays in the collection that do talk about survival cannibalism. I was an associate editor for a special issue that we did coming out of the conference with Exchanges, which is a journal at the University of Warwick through the Institute for Advanced Studies. And there's definitely articles about survival cannibalism in various novels in that. But Tender is the Flesh is more of a similar institutionalized version of cannibalism, where it's sort of made, it's reconfigured as somehow ethically plausible, even though Tender is the Flesh does explicitly undermine this supposed ethical farming, because it really isn't ethical, but they reform it in a way that it seems okay to the average person if they don't have to look at it. But Tender is the Flesh is really interesting because it doesn't quite give the type of justification that meat or animals does. It doesn't really explain past sort of saying that people started doing survival cannibalism or started cannibalizing other people's in order to get meat because they could. And the animal extinction is not actually an extinction, but rather a virus that people became so afraid of that they killed all animals because it was contagious and they were worried about being contaminated. So it has a slightly different premise, but it also pulls out a lot of things that I think are quite interesting. So it talks about eating prostitutes, for example, so that men could pay to have sex with a woman and then pay more money to eat her, which is horrifying, obviously. But it also plays into some of my other interests, which is in vitro meat, which Josh, you're aware of, obviously, because we've done the In Vitro Meat Ethics and Culture afternoon of talks together. And there's a novella by Lauren Bucas called Ungirls, which has a sort of similar premise of sort of edible sex dolls. But yeah, there's a lot of room to expand this type of analysis, I think. There's also a short story by Vandana Singh called Are You Sonata 3159, which has a similar institutionalized cannibalism novum, but involves these shakes or smoothies that the workers drink that make them oblivious to the pain that they're causing. And so they're able to process their own relatives and not realize. So that kind of adds an extra layer. There's a lot of work that's coming out that engages with these type of subjects. So there's definitely room to expand.
That's very interesting. And you raised there an issue which I think needs mentioning, and that's the link between cannibalism and sexuality. Mm-hmm. So in animal studies, We have the idea of the sexual politics of meat coming especially from Carol Adams, but a lot of thinkers. This link between the sexualization of women and the edibility of animals. So you get this reverse, you get the edibility of women and the sexualization of animals. These things become intimately linked. And of course, in literary studies as well, just to pick one example, the idea of vampires, the consumption of humans by vampires is linked so closely to sexuality and to sex. So in these novels, or perhaps we could say more broadly in speculative fiction, what do you see as the link between sexuality and cannibalism, if there is one?
So in the novels, there are definitely, at least in Meat by DeLacy, there's an explicit link where one of the man who runs the dairy side of the factory farming institution actually ends up being turned into meat because he fraternizes with one of the milk animals, with one of the cows, which is obviously not a cow, but a human woman. And so there's this sort of sexploitation aspect to it. So the connection between cannibalism and sexuality, I think, is they're both forms of consumption. In that special issue that I mentioned in Exchanges, there's an article, I can't remember the exact title, but it's like The Kiss is the Beginning of Cannibalism, or The Kiss is the Start of Cannibalism, that talks really explicitly about this. Let me see. I remember flagging something in Tenders the Flesh that speaks to this. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Yeah, so they're talking about eating someone alive, and it says, "You're extracting life by the mouthful. It's the pleasure of knowing that because of your intent, your actions, this being has ceased to exist. It's the feeling of a complex and precious organism expiring little by little and also becoming part of you." And that quote really made me think of how the orgasm in French is sometimes called le petit mort, like this little death. So I think I've quite inadequately answered that question, but the answer is yes, there are connections, and perhaps other people will articulate them better than I have.
No, this is great. So there's clearly a lot of work left to be done on linking these things in speculative fiction generally and in these particular works of speculative fiction. That's fascinating. So let me ask about the value of engaging with these kinds of things. What do you think, specifically for animal studies scholars, is the value of engaging with speculative fiction? Or perhaps to put it another way, do you think that it's important for scholars of animal studies to be reading speculative fiction or to be reading scholarly work that engages with speculative fiction?
I mean, I think it definitely is enriching for animal studies to look at speculative fiction, or to be aware at least of some of the work going on in speculative fiction, because a lot of the things that are happening in terms of animals in biotech or sort of animal ethics, they're being explored in speculative fiction novels in ways that I think open up and create new narratives, and also explore sort of different possibilities and different solutions for different types of problems to do with the way that we relate to non-human animals. So, for example, Adam Roberts has a novel called Bet, which is about a sort of PETA type organization starts putting chips in animals that at first have them say slogans, but eventually either the technology becomes so advanced, or there's sort of a fusing like post-animal thing happening with the chip where the animals are able to speak for themselves. And there's a whole question of whether they're actually speaking or it's some sort of computerized thing in them that's an AI that's speaking. But all of the animals who have the chip and who speak cannot be eaten. It becomes against the law. Whereas the animals who don't speak can still be eaten, and it's fine. And I think it really, that sort of novum, which is not really something that would actually, I mean, it's potential that we could develop some sort of animal translator. There's all these videos now online of dogs pressing buttons and expressing desires, although it's unclear whether or not they're actually expressing desires or if they've figured out this button means that I get a treat or whatever. But these alternative visions, even if they're implausible, create space to look at things like, okay, well, how do we understand non-human animals? Are we only seeing them as a reflection of our own desires and our own understandings, or are we trying to understand them on their own terms? It creates this otherworldly space that leaves room for alternative voices. I think one of the big powers of speculative fiction is that it creates this space to think of alternatives. And by engaging with speculative fiction, by reading speculative fiction, by reading about speculative fiction, animal studies scholars can sort of find different ways to shape narratives and find creative ways that people are thinking about the way we relate to non-human animals, and also look at the potential socio-political consequences of technologies that are still in development in our world, but that in these novels have already come to pass and what could happen. And it helps with an analysis of what are the potential dangers of things like, I don't know, genetic engineering or cloning as part of livestock production or things like that.
Thanks, that's fascinating. Could you just say the name and author of that novel again in case any listeners want to look it up?
Sure, it's Adam Roberts, Bete, Bete.
Thanks. Now, Nora, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I'm ready.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Ooh, that's a tough one. So I've kind of fallen into animal studies by accident via food studies, especially because I look a lot at meat. So through the cannibalism work, but also through the work on in vitro meat. And you can't talk about meat without talking about animals, obviously. So I think it almost certainly is something to do with food studies. The thing that comes to mind actually is there was this article in Lucky Peach, which is a now defunct foodie magazine, and it was asking whether we could have ethical foie gras and what that would look like. So I think that probably was one of the first pieces of scholarship that really registered with me and that really asked questions from a point of view of consideration of the animal and of quality of life for non-human animals, rather than just asking how we can consume something and from a sort of anthropocentric point of view. So I'll go with that one.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
I mean, in terms of available outputs, I guess it would be this chapter. I mean, I'm still in doing my PhD, so I'm kind of a baby academic at this point. But yeah, I guess it would probably be this chapter.
That's great, that's fine.
You're at the very beginning of my animal studies journey, so that's really cool.
No, well, that's good. And we are keen to welcome people into animal studies who are maybe coming from different kinds of directions. You know, not everybody who is doing important work in animal studies has always been doing that work. Even though you may feel like you've fallen into animal studies by accident, I hope you'll stay. I hope you find it a nice area to be.
Yeah, and that's the power of the fiction, right? Is that's how I came into this, is by reading these novels. So there you go.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
So the person that I immediately thought of was Cheryl Vint, who's really well known in science fiction studies. I'm not sure how well known she is in animal studies proper, but she's written a book called Animal Alterity, Science Fiction and the Question of the Animal. And she was also the editor of a special issue of science fiction studies on animals and science fiction. And she's written a lot about animals in SF. So I think she's just really a badass lady in general. So I think she's a great example of showing how these fields can converge. So that's really inspirational for me.
What's the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
Ooh, this one's hard because, in literary studies, I mean, me writing a book chapter about 2 novels is not really going to reshape the future of animal agriculture. But at the same time, I think these futures that are being created and these futures that are being analyzed are really important for our understanding of how we relate to the non-human world. And because, I mean, so many of these startups, for example, that are developing alternative proteins or that are working on animal-related biotech are creating these narratives themselves in their marketing and even just in terms of their work being funded by venture capital. So it's based on speculative capital. So I think that in terms of what academics in my field can do for animals is sort of imagine, critique, and help shape these alternative futures. So make that space to see our relationships with the non-human world differently. Obviously, that's less material than I would like. I mean, I engage more with sort of material eco-criticism and what's the actual material consequences or material essence of food systems. So I wish that there was something a bit more material to say, but I think, yeah, these alternative futures, actually, the importance of them can't be understated. So looking at those and talking about those and critiquing those.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
So I think this is something that I need to also change within myself, which is part of the problem with the way that we understand the non-human world is that humans tend to either anthropomorphize everything or to go with the human superiority thing where there's the human and there's the non-human. And I think that the one thing I would change would be this focus on perceived intelligence from a human perspective in animals, and that being how we evaluate their worth and whether or not they should have consideration. So, for example, I might feel worse eating an octopus than eating a duck, but that's totally constructed and honestly a little bit ridiculous. But it's because I can see more quote unquote human intelligence in an octopus than a duck. So I would change that way of valuing animal life in myself and more generally.
What is it you're working on next?
So I have a lot of irons in the fire. I love a side project. So I've been working on some stuff with in vitro meat, which, Josh, you know and have been involved with. I'm also working on some things with kitchens and kitchen tech and plants and agricultural architecture and things like that. But I guess the thing that's most relevant here would be that I'm co-editing a special issue of Green Letters on animal futurity, which should come out in February of next year, so 2022. And that's going to be really exciting. It's a selection of articles that are really interdisciplinary in scope, that are focused on sort of the future of the animal and the future of human and animal relations across a really wide range of countries and a wide range of animal species. So that's really exciting. And I've also got a special issue on food futures, which will be coming out in Science Fiction Studies in March of 2022.
How can people find out more about your work?
So I'm on Twitter. You can follow me at Nora_Castle. But I also update my publications and everything on my Warwick departmental page. So you can find me there or on academia.edu or any of those networking sites. And if anyone is interested in anything that I've said, you can definitely feel free to shoot me an email. And my email is listed on that departmental page.
Well, thanks so much for joining us for this episode, Nora.
Thanks. Thanks so much for having me. It's been fun.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Also, don't forget to tell others about us and to review the podcast where you found us. Reviews make it easier for others to find the podcast. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.